Welcome to Sparks of History, where Jewish history and world history meet. We are very honored and pleased to have with us today Rabbi Jonathan Ziring. Rabbi Ziring received rabbinic ordination semichah from the Rabbi Isaac Elchanan Theological Seminary at Yeshiva University and received an MA in Jewish philosophy from the Bernard Revel Graduate School and a BA from the honors program at the Yeshiva College of Yeshiva University. Rabbi Ziring studied at Yeshivat Har Etzion and continued his learning there as a member of the Kollel Gavoah. Rabbi Ziring was also a fellow at the Tikvah Fund and at the Center for Modern Torah Leadership's summer Beit Midrash. Rabbi Ziring has previously served as Sgan Rosh Kollel of the Yeshiva University Torah miTzion Beit Midrash Zichron Dove in Toronto and as the rabbinic assistant of the BAYT in Toronto, Ontario. Currently, Rabbi Ziring serves as Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshivat Migdal HaTorah, located in Modiin, Israel. And today we'll be discussing Rabbi Ziring's recently published, absolutely fascinating sefer book, Torah in a Connected World, a halachic perspective on communication technology and social media. Thank you, Rabbi Ziring, for being with us. We appreciate it very much.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited for this conversation.
Okay. The book, if you could just in general tell us the thesis behind the book and what methodology do you employ in evaluating the halachic legal ramifications of new communication technologies and platforms?
So the thesis of the book really, and this is part of a broader project that I'm committed to, is as the Rav Rabbi Soloveitchik writes in several places that if he had the ability to write a 14th animamin, a 14th tenet of faith, he would write that would be the belief that the Torah is relevant in every generation, and I find it very important to talk about new technologies. Because really engaging with them in a serious way reflects the belief that the Torah is relevant. And I want to be precise that it can be relevant in different ways, right? Sometimes when people approach technological questions, they only care about whether Torah can be sufficiently responsive, right? That a new question comes up and it knows how to deal with it. It knows how to tell people to act on Shabbat, with whether you violate Shabbat with a particular use of technology, whether a particular type of lab grown meat, how do we treat it in terms of kashrut, and that's obviously very important. But I think what's often missed is the even broader question, which is how can halacha shape and provide a framework for the way we think about how technology should develop. And that can be relevant practically. It's not often relevant practically, but that's more, I think, our fault that we don't go out into the world to make a case. But sometimes it really is. If you ever looked at the President's Bioethics Council, when stem cell research was really first becoming a thing, the President coordinated a council of different thinkers, religious leaders, including rabbis, and secular, philosophers, with the intent of developing a framework for this technology that was, either at its infancy, or in some cases parts of it didn't exist yet, because he believed that religious traditions have something to say about how technology should develop in the future. So to really center on this belief that Torah is always relevant, I want to find the ways in which it responds, but also in the ways it speaks to the way we should interact with technology, develop newer technologies. This particular book was focused on communication technology and social media. But people think when they talk communication technology, they're thinking modern communication technology. They're thinking about smartphones and all the means that we use to communicate on them, whether that be, FaceTime and WhatsApp and Zoom, or various social media platforms, whether it be Instagram or TikTok or, Facebook, which is a bit older, or Twitter or X or whatever it's called now. But the truth is that, communication technology has been changing life for a very long time. And we forget that things like high-speed trains or even functioning mail service was a communication, was it a development in communication technology, right? Even, just the fact that you could, send a letter to someone and it would get there in a matter of weeks instead of years was a significant increase in the frequency and the certainty that one could ever communicate with people that no longer live nearby, and therefore, these questions, if you think deeply about them, have been coming up for a long time. So my goal was to sort of dig into the halachic system, tease out the principles, and then apply them to modern technologies, but also with an eye towards the broader question, so that as technology changes, we'll have a framework for dealing with them, again, both responsively and proactively.
Okay, so this obviously goes beyond, is are new technologies good or not good? This is not a critique or technology, social media is bad or it's good. We're not talking about that. We're really trying to put this into a different type of framework.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the some of the questions of is it good, is it bad, those are also very important questions. But the question of whether it's good or bad, or sometimes the even more nitty-gritty questions of if we're going to use it, how should we use it? Questions like, if you're going to use a smartphone, should you put a filter on it? And if a filter, what type? Those are important questions. But the broad questions, I think, go beyond that. And I don't, some of the chapters maybe deal with more detailed questions. But yeah, I mean, I think one of the challenges of writing a book like this is just that the technology changes so fast. So if you get caught in the weeds, by time, the number of years it takes from when you start writing a book to when it goes through editing and publication, dealing with the details is just, it's going to be irrelevant. I mean, some of the things I'd started writing as a series in the VBM several years ago, and I had to change any chapter that said Skype to Zoom, because by time the book came to publication and by the time I really sat to turn it into book form, we'd gone through COVID and Zoom had gone from being non-existent to being what we're using right now. So while the questions of the details, I think, are important, and it's a very important question of when you give your child a phone, whenever that is, what type of phone do you give them, and what what access does it have, and things like that. I think those can be important questions, but I focus much more on the frameworks, because at some level, even if you don't have a phone, you don't have a smartphone, your neighbor does, and if there's important information, you'll find out about it. I mean, you can say, a few weeks ago when the 4 hostages were saved on Shabbat, those of us who are Shomer Shabbat, so we didn't see the news on Shabbat. And you can say, well, I keep Shabbat, I didn't see the news. But as you saw, there were many secular Jews who wanted to spread the news. So they wrote that, 4 Chatufim were saved. Now, that was a violation of Shabbat to write it. And, and obviously then it meant well, and everyone was excited. But my point, is simply that you can't escape it, right? The fact is that there are, like, you could ask a question. If you found out the news because someone who does use their phone on Shabbat told you, do you make the bracha v'tov v'ametiv, right? You can try to escape the technology as much as you want, but the fact is that the technology has now impacted you, whether you like it or not. So no, I don't really get into the question of good or bad, because this is the reality. We live in this world, and we need a framework for dealing with it. And I did, for the most part, avoid questions like that, because and again, as I said, some of the questions with social media are really just developments of the question that came from a functioning mail, and like, okay, so you don't want to get a smartphone that has WhatsApp, fine, but the reality is that some of the questions are going to be the same, and unless you want to turn back the clock on on mail and trains and planes and stuff like that. Those are all, while they're also travel, they also affect communication, right? If you can travel 6,000 miles in 12 hours and talk to your parent who lives in Israel and you live in America, or vice versa, that's also that has effect on communication, and that's technological impact on communication. So to reject everything is just impossible. I don't think anyone really wants to. It's much more at the margins of which technologies you accept, but the framework, I really avoided those details because I just don't think you can escape it.
Getting into some of the specifics, the communication impact on issues such as divorce, get, or a topic such as agunot. How did you deal with that in the book, in the Sefer?
So that was an interesting case, because there's, when look, when I first sat to write down some of these topics, and I told people I was writing this, most people jumped to the halachot of lashon hara, because lashon hara, people think, oh, communication, social media. You're talking lashon hara. You're talking embarrassing people in public, and obviously that is a section in the book. But one of the things that I wanted to do in the book was show how these same technologies impact so many different areas of life. And since halacha is the instruction guide for living life, obviously, if it affects different aspects of our life, then it affects different aspects of halacha. And as you mentioned, there are many topics in marriage law or divorce law that were affected, both the classic aguna question and the modern aguna question, to take examples, and not just agunot, right? There was at least 3 sections in the book that dealt with various marriage laws. So the first one actually was very interesting. Is the first shaila that was ever asked about video teleconferencing, the first Zoom shaila, which people think is, whenever I ask people, what do you think the first shaila was about Zoom? So they always guess that it's I don't know, something in the 2000 pluses about, either they think during COVID, maybe a few years before that. But the truth is that the first question about video teleconferencing was a Gittin question, and it was written in the late 19th century. Rabbi Shmelkes, in the Tshuvat Beit Yitzchak, was asked, he was in the middle of a discussion, a technical question about Tzivui HaBa'al, and the rule is that by a get, the get must be written under direct instruction from the husband. The husband has to instruct the sofer, the edem, right, the scribe, and the witnesses to write the get. And the question then developed: is it considered direct communication to the sofer using a telegraph, using a telephone? And in the Beit Yitzchak, he was asked about this, and at the end of the tshuva, he has this little addendum, and he says, if they will one day have a what we would know as video teleconferencing, or Zoom, or WhatsApp video, or FaceTime, or whatever you want to call it. Now he wrote it as telectroscope, or something like that. Which Shlomo Brody has an excellent article pointing out that was the word that was used to describe video teleconferencing in sci-fi at the time. And apparently Rabbi Shmelkes had, it was in the air or something like that, that people knew that this technology could one day exist. And he actually writes about, would that count as a tzivui haba'al, right? Would that be direct enough? And he was in many ways inclined to say that it might be. Obviously the technology didn't exist; we didn't have to firmly rule on it. But he was inclined to accept it, and therefore, modern poskim who have dealt with this shaila have invoked this tshuva that was written over 100 years ago on that. So that's sort of one Gittin area, and then there's the classic aguna. Now, classic aguna is the case of simply a woman who she doesn't know whether her husband is alive. Now, the Mishnah's description of that is what's called Maim She'en Lem Sof. Right? A case where you see that a husband falls into a body of water, but it's not like a easily self-contained body of water, and therefore you can't see the other sides. You can't be 100% certain whether the husband emerged from the other side or actually drowned. So in that circumstance, the Gemara says the woman is an aguna, a classic aguna, because you don't know whether her husband has died. Now, already in the Gemara, there are hints to the possibility that this isn't a rule forever. The Gemara cites the position that if the husband is a Talmid Chacham, then the woman would eventually become permitted to her husband, to remarry rather, under the belief that if he's a Talmid Chacham and he's well known enough, so if he survives, the information will get back. Now, this position is rejected by the Chachamim, but and this was excellently detailed in an essay summarizing some of the issues that arose after 9/11. The Beit in America put out a little like a 200-page book on the halachic issues and hashkafic issues after 9/11, and one of them was questions of are there circumstances in which not hearing that the husband is alive is positive evidence, either conclusive evidence or at least a piece of evidence that can contribute to the halachic conclusion that the husband is dead. And what Jachter excellently points out there is that there is a slow development of poskim who said that even though the Gemara rejects the position by the Talmid Chacham, that's not a principled rejection of the notion that silence can never be evidence. It simply might be a claim that silence is not sufficient evidence in a world where travel is still difficult and communication technology isn't developed. And therefore, every few hundred years, you get a posek who says, well, the Chachamim didn't agree to that position then, but now things have developed. Or they didn't, and then, the poskim will say, nah, it hasn't changed enough. And then 200 years later, another posek will say, well, now it's gotten better. And therefore, it's even more likely that silence is reason to believe that the husband is probably dead. And you see that the poskim, after 9/11, were willing to incorporate this as one of their heterim, not the exclusive heter, but one of the factors in permitting women to get remarried if there were husbands who there was no reason to believe that they would run away, and they had been placed in the towers when they crashed. But the fact that communication technology is so good that if he wanted to communicate with his wife, and even if he was had amnesia, he would probably have his wallet on him or some sort of form of ID, and they could communicate. You could just carry this argument that's found in Truman Adeshin and then the Chatam Sofer, etc., and that can be at least one of the svarot to allow a woman to remarry. So that was the second application in the world of Gittin. The third was in what we call like a modern aguna, which is a husband who refuses to give his wife a get. We know exactly where he is. He doesn't want to give his wife a get. Historically, what happened was a get needs to be given, as we know, of the free volition of the husband. But certain types of communal pressure, Zakon of Rabbeinu Tam, were permitted. They weren't considered to be improperly coercive, without getting into all the details. The problem was that all of those mechanisms functioned in a self-contained society where people had to be part of the Jewish community, often legally, right? To have legal rights, you had to be part of a Jewish community. So rejecting the person from the community had real cost, and therefore could persuade the husband to give a get. After emancipation, people could travel and leave the community, and therefore it was very hard to pressure husbands into giving a get using these various takanot. That began to change with social media, because social media and social media shaming allowed us to essentially recreate a version of the global community, which made it that the husband could no longer escape, right? He might live several thousand miles away and move to the middle of nowhere, but once they find out where the husband is, they can shame him, they can shame his boss, they can pressure his company, his clients, whatever the case may be. And this came to a head when a Beit Din in Israel argued that we should use the power of social media to basically recreate these takanot Rabbeinu Tam to coerce a husband who's been nagging his wife to give her a get. And at the time, several very thoughtful Rabbanim, Rav Shurlo, Rav Chaim Navon, wrote pieces on it, arguing that on the one hand, it's true that we have sort of recreated the community through technology, such that these takanot can be effective. The problem is that there's significant differences in a real community and this virtual community. One is that takanot Rabbeinu Tam were employed by the Beit, but social media shaming, in order to be effective, has to be weaponized, as it were, by everybody. And that gives us less control to make sure it's happening in a way that would be in line with halachic strictures. And the second is that it's much harder to take it back, right? If the Beit says, you can't do business with this person, so he gives the get, you now say, that's it. Now you can do business with him. If you post on his Yelp or whatever on his business page, even if he gives the get, it's very hard to pull that back. Now, they didn't reject the notion that we should use it, but they were highlighting the fact that on the one hand, the technology has allowed us to recreate a certain mechanism, but the differences in terms of the way it has to be utilized force us to really ask, how do we do it responsibly? Because yes, we've created a community, a globalized community that mimics what used to exist, but it only mimics it, and the differences are important. So those are the three sort of marriage-related issues that I touched on that all highlight the way in which these technologies really profoundly affect every area of life. And I don't think, if you told the average person, how does social media affect halacha, these are the three areas they would have jumped to.
Well, would you envision a situation where you'd have a Beit Din that is proficient, is an expert in shaming, with a staff that could shame halachically and take things back? I mean, is that something that could happen in real life?
I mean, half of that, yes, half of that, no. I mean, I could imagine a world in which, there's a Beit Din that's an expert in utilizing the tools of social media shaming. That's no different than the Beit Din of America having, a lawyer on staff, a dayan who also went to law school, and dayanim who went to business school to consult on relevant issues. The second half of it, I don't think will happen, right? The taking it back, that's one of the realities of the internet, is you can't really take it back. You can't be an expert in taking it back. That's not, that's not really a thing. I mean, there have been legal cases about the quote unquote right to be forgotten. But it's much easier said than done, and it's not really easy to erase something from the internet. I mean, if you've ever tried to erase something from the internet, you'll know that, okay, it won't be on the internet primarily, but you can find it on archive. If you know what you're looking for, you'll find it on the Wayback Machine on archive.org or something like that. So the first half of it, I think, in terms of expertise, sure, I don't see any reason why, a Beit Din couldn't. I mean, as it is, right? Ora, the Organization for Resolution of Agunot works very closely with the dayanim of the Beit Din of America. So in that sense, they are partnered with them, and they only use their the shaming tools in their toolbox with the go ahead of various Batei Din, and often they consult on with the dayanim, and and other poskim in that orbit. So it's not hard for me to imagine, and at some level, I think this is the reality that people are. I actually spoke to Ray Willig about this recently. He was very interested in this topic for obvious reasons, being a dayan in the Beit Din of America and a supporter of the prenup and the halachic prenup and all the mechanisms to prevent modern agunot. He obviously has a very vested interest in all these halachic discussions. So it's definitely the case that Batei Din can have an expertise either independently or sort of adjacent to experts, but pulling back and retracting it, that's not a question of expertise. That's really that's the name of the game in the internet, is that you just can't. Um, I don't think there's any, at least as the technology exists now. I mean, I imagine it'll only get worse, but you never know. It could get better, I guess.
What is, Rabbi Ziring, what is the overall Jewish view regarding privacy, and how have social platforms and the wide dissemination of information challenged those views?
So privacy. So it's hard to say the Jewish view on privacy. Um, but there are there are various halachic models that have been proposed by poskim over the years to ground. I will be careful in my language here. Either a right to privacy, but or at least a responsibility of others to respect your privacy, which may have a derivative right. Right. This is a broader question, which I won't get into too much, and how much halacha actually recognizes rights per se, and how much halacha focuses on responsibilities, which has implied rights, right? If I can't harm you, so you have an implied right to, let's say, whatever, bodily safety or something like that. But that, it might be different than rights. Many, both sort of broader thinkers and many, classic thinkers have believed that halacha doesn't really deal with rights. It deals with responsibilities and implied rights, though recently, several years ago, there was an article by Rabbi Itamar Rosenzweig arguing that that's not really true, that there are several halachot that seem to talk about rights per se. But for the moment, let's not get into that sort of nuance. But either does halacha recognize a right to privacy or a responsibility for other people to respect your privacy? Big Adol, the question is, it seems to at some level. Now, obviously, the devil is in the details here, but to just give a few models that emerge. So one is Lashon Hara. Now, Lashon Hara, people tend to think of as gossip, and that's because they're very influenced by the Rambam and the Chavetz Chaim, who was very influenced by the Rambam. And the Rambam thought that primarily Lashon Hara meant that there's a prohibition to gossip. However, if you look at many other Rishonim, and the Gaonim, that might not be the case. So if you look in the Shilta of Rav Achai Gaon, or even you look in the Ritva, they argue that based on this sugya in the third paragraph of Baba Batra, so they argue that Lashon Hara is actually either exclusively or at least sometimes a prohibition of violating confidentiality, of taking something that was meant to be private and spreading it. Right? And they derive that, again, from the sugya in Baba Batra, which compares Lashon Hara to the mechanism of micha'ah. Right? The Gemara there is talking about Chazkat Gimel Shanim, how do you create squatters' rights? And the way to break squatters' rights is to protest. And the Gemara there says that if you're not present with the squatter, so if you protest in front of 3 people, so then that counts. Because just like Lashon Hara, we say that Kol Milta de Mitamra Ba'pe Plata, anything that's said in front of 3 people, let Ba Mishum Lishna Bisha, which is an infamously hard line to define. There is no problem of Lashon Hara. So the same thing is true of Mecha. Now, at least the way these Rishonim understand it there is that anything, if you think that Lashon Hara is simply a breach of confidentiality, so what it means is anything that has already been said in front of 3 people is already presumed public, and therefore you can no longer breach confidentiality by telling it over again because it's already known. Based on that, the Ritva there writes that Lashon Hara sometimes means Gili Sod, the revelation of secrets. So one possible source for a notion in halacha or grounding in halacha of privacy and confidentiality is Lashon Hara. A second model is a Gemara in Yom Daled, where the Gemara says that when God speaks to Moshe, so he ends his statement with Lamor, which the Gemara says from here you learn that you can't say anything that was told to you in confidence until we tell you to say. Rashi assumes this is a conjunction of, we read Lamor as lo emor, right? Don't say. Now it's not clear whether that's a hard and fast halacha, whether it's a derech eretz, as the Meiri would have it here, but it's clearly a value. a halachically recognized value, if you want to be, not too precise. For those learning Daf Yomi, a third model that emerges is from the Dapim that we're reading right now. That the Gemara at the beginning of Bava Batra introduces a concept of hezek re'iyah, of visual damage or visual assault, where peering, that building your house in such a way that you're able to peer into other people's property, and then the Gemara gets into houses and yards and which one. But in principle, this idea that there's something called hezek re'iyah, and if that's the case, this is actually a form of it's under a part of tort law. And it's a type of assault to violate someone's privacy. And then there's a discussion in the Rishonim already whether this would extend beyond visual damages to audio, to hearing, eavesdropping, and the like. It's a discussion Meiri and Relio Mizrahi, again, without getting into all the details, you can look in the book for some of the details. But that's a third model that potentially can ground it. There are obviously broader values like V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha and the like that the poskim invoke. There are discussions around the chirem of Rabbeinu Gershom to not read other people's mail, which again, it's not clear in the poskim whether he was introducing an isser or he was introducing sanctions for a pre-existing isser, and then you have to figure out what the isser is. So these are just some of the models. Rabbi Lamb has an excellent article that he wrote after Roe v. Wade, trying to ground it. He also tries to ground it hashkafically, and he interestingly argues that the notion of privacy in halacha is grounded in the in imitatio Dei, in the fact that we have to imitate God, and God is at least sometimes described as being secretive and not revealing his whole self, and therefore hashkafically he grounds the idea that the divinity within every person allows them a certain amount of privacy. So big adol, yes, there does seem to be some sort of respect in halacha for privacy. Again, it matters which of these models you take because they'll have different, expressions, of it. And obviously, the more formal it is, sometimes the harder it's going to be to come up with, exceptions and the like. But I think it's fair to say that there definitely is a long-standing tradition in halacha of recognizing a certain amount of either right to privacy or obligation on others to respect privacy or not to breach confidentiality. Again, the devil is in the details, but in principle, yeah, I think there is, and interested reader can look. Nachum Rackover wrote an excellent book devoted just to the topic of privacy in halacha from the vantage point of Mishpat Ivri. So there really, that's something that has actually been developed in halacha.
And again, the implications of the communication technologies on privacy, what are the issues that you discussed in the Sefer?
Look, the implications, are vast, meaning, like if you take, for example, I mentioned the Kol Milta Debit Amra Ba'Beit Plata Lit B'Mizon Lishna Bisha. So again, that's a very hard line to parse. But at least some of the Rishonim understand it to mean that anything that's already public, it's no longer forbidden to continue spreading it because it's already known. You're not doing anything. However, the Rambam qualifies that. And the Rambam says that's only if you're not going to spread it farther than it already has been spread. So it's already known in your community. Okay, so you talk about this, either gossip or secret, whichever Lashon Hara you want to take, in your community, you're not going to violate. But if you're going to spread it farther, so then it's going to be then it might still be usher. Now, one of the dangers of social media is that, look, something might be well known in your shul, but that doesn't mean it's known in the world. You put it on if you're a bit older, you put it on Facebook, or if you put it younger, you put it on Instagram or TikTok or whatever, right? It can easily be seen by a million people in a matter of hours, and therefore it would run afoul of the Rambam's formulation, which is even if something is public, there's public and then there's really, really public. Mitzad Sheni, it can work lakula, meaning if someone already did that, it may be that, well, look, it may be terrible, but is it really fair to say that now I can't talk about it, right? Something's in the news, it's already been scooped. am I limited? It might not be. And, the technology really changes the game. Now, there are very interesting discussions in some modern poskim about what if it's known, but it's fallen out of the news cycle, right? Because, and this is one of those interesting things where because we have so much information, it could be that we know things, but they're in the back of our mind because we've been inundated with so much information. So based on that insight, certain poskim ask, well, what if something's fallen out of the news cycle? So it's true that someone could Google it. And or even if they didn't Google it, they might vaguely remember that this happened a year ago. But by you bringing it up again, you are doing something qualitatively differently. Is that usser? And that's an interesting question because that's arguing that dafka, because we have so much information, because information is so cheap and so quick to spread, that it might be that information that was once known, even if it's sort of known, is not known anymore, right? We reach our natural limit of what's in our working memory. And obviously, if that's the case, then yeah, it's specifically the over inundation of information that we get through all the modes of communication that create the possibility for a poststate to say, you know what, even something that's known bisman hazeh, bringing back into the news cycle, like this day in history, gossip from this day in history, even if it's technically known, like you could look it up, it's on the Wikipedia page, it might still be usher because of the Rambam's insight that just because something is known, that you can, make it more known or make it known more qualitatively or more viscerally. So obviously, when it comes to these things, everything comes down to hammering into the reality and how exactly are people thinking and how are they communicating and what do they know and what are they aware of in an active sense, what's latent knowledge, and technology shapes the way we experience it, and therefore these halachot that are built on what do people know and how does that affect them and the like. Obviously, the technology, understanding the technology is critical to be able to figure out what halacha would say about it.
I was you write in the book this concept of we traditionally had the idea of there was a local rabbinic authority, the Mord Atra, and today everybody jokes. How do you find what the law says, what the halacha says? I look up Rabbi Google. That's the classical joke. What has technology done for this whole concept of the Mord Atra, the local rabbinic authority, how halachic decisions are made? How do you deal with that in the book?
So look, there are really many questions that are relevant there. In the book, I deal less with the Rabbi Google question, and more with a related question. But I'll talk about what I deal with more in the book, and then I'll touch on the Rabbi Google question. The question I deal with more in the book is not a question where someone no longer has a rabbinic authority and just Googles things, but is the question of which I think most people, the Rabbi Google thing, you're right. It's become like a joke, and people are like offended by it. Like you've replaced rabbis with, non-experts just Googling and, but often that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about very serious people who are not trying to shop for leniencies. It's just that, I don't know, they have a very close relationship with their Rebbe from yeshiva, with the rabbi of the shul they grew up with their principal from high school, with a friend who is also a rabbi but understands them and knows them since they were children and can relate to their circumstances, and they relate to those people more than their current shul rabbi, or maybe they don't have a shul rabbi, right? Or maybe they don't have in Israel, as not every shul has a rabbi, right? So they live in a community, and like here where I live, there are 5 shuls in the area, only one of which officially has a rabbi. So maybe they don't have a rabbi at all. So the question I really deal with in the book is, the classic model of halachic authority, at least one of them that's discussed already in the Mishnayot and developed in the Gemara, is the idea of Mord Atra, the notion that the rabbi of a geographic area has the final say in halacha. But nowadays, people, even if they want a posek, often that posek is not determined by them geographically, but is determined communally or ideologically, right? I really identify with my Rebbe from Yeshiva, and I love talking and learning with him. So I call him for my shilas. Okay, if it's Shabbat and I don't have access, and I have a Shabbat shilah, I'll ask whichever rabbi you see. But like the big shilas in my life, I call this person I've had a connection to for 30 years. That's a very interesting phenomenon, because what it does is it cuts to the question of, did Gemara imagine that a Mar Da'atra gets his authority because he's the local rabbi, or because he's the rabbi of community, which in a world in which communication was difficult, community was almost always geographic. Whereas now we may have our geographic community, but we also have our ideological community. Now, Rav Lichtenstein has an article where he points out that at some level, the first person to ask this question, as far as he knows, was the Rashba. The Rashba in his Tshuvot in Aleph, Reish, and Gimel was asked if communities could start relying on the Rif or the Rambam instead, as their posek. Right? Already then, there were people who were following, the Rif and the Rambam way after they were dead. And the Rashba said yes, with some hedging, right? He said that if they actually have a local rabbi and he disagrees with the Rambam here and there, they should follow their rabbi, because the Rambam is only ki'ilu, their Mar Da'atra. So Rav Lichtenstein there notes already that at least half the equation, right? The idea that the rabbi doesn't need to be geographic. The Rashba is willing to accept that at some level, yes, you don't need a Mara who is in the Atra. You don't need the rabbi to be in the place. You don't even need him to be alive at some level. Again, with qualifications. Rav Lichtenstein then takes it farther and he says, well, what if the community isn't geographic, right? The case that the Raj was dealing with is a geographic community that takes a virtual rabbi. Not virtual in the way we have it, but virtual, in the sense of like the demut of the Rambam. And Rav Lichtenstein thought that it should be obvious once you have the Raj, but the community also doesn't need to be geographic. And that, I believe his example is like a Ger Chassid who lives, not next to the Ger Rebbe, has every right to paskin like the Rebbe. Broadly speaking, I have, there was a review recently written of my book, and the reviewer correctly noted that while in certain circumstances I'm not thrilled with the redefinition of community, and this one I seem to have sympathy for it, and I think I'm guilty as charged. That to me, I think that there is a logic to that. That if one wants to choose a posek or poskim, I don't think you have to have one posek, but if you want to have a posek, I think that there is something very healthy about choosing a posek who you identify with, who you have a connection with, who understands you, who you're going to feel confident that they're giving you the right answer. And the fact that they might live 6,000 miles away from you or whatever, just in the neighboring city, I don't see that being an obstacle. And therefore, I do have an affinity for the idea that Mar Da'atra can be re-understood ideologically. The second question of, can you then, and obviously the plethora of information that is available online, not just Makorot, not just like Sefaria and the like, where you can just have easy access to Makorot, but also like well-written shuvot that are analysis by prominent poskim, right? Not just that really does change the game. Now that's a different question. Now I do think that if someone is knowledgeable enough to assess the the quality of the arguments that are being made, so under certain circumstances that is legitimate. I think on very sensitive questions, it's very important to be able to, if you're not an expert, it's important to be able to turn to experts who are going to be able to follow up with questions and figure out whether you're the uniqueness of your situation. And there I get very wary of people who only, again, a simple shayla, I don't think so, right? I don't think you need to bother, pre-Pesach. I think I think every rabbi in the world would tell you that if you can find your answer on how to kosher your, stovetop from the very well done videos on the OU or Hafk or Star K website, and cut down the shilas that the rabbi needs to field, I think most rabbis would say, go to Rabbi it's not Rabbi Google. Go to, the experts at the OU. Often I send my students there and I say, listen, I know the halacha, but, you're telling me that your, countertop is made of this material. I don't know, it's a new material. I don't know what it is. The OU has a list, right? Go through and they'll answer it. That, I think that, it's very legitimate. People who think that like sensitive shilas where there's a need to really understand the details, both the miTzion and the emotional impact and all of that, I think it would be chaval to give up on having a relationship with any posek, even if that posek isn't local. I don't think it has to be your local rabbi, but to pick up the phone or set up a Zoom call and talk to someone you trust. I think that remains very important in at least in the more complicated shilas that you're going to get. Someone who, and again, also just the ability to follow up, right? Sometimes someone will think about something that that didn't come up with the original shilah. If they don't know who you are, or you never asked a question, that's just never going to be analyzed. And I think so while I have sympathy for the treating your Rebbe as the person you have a connection to, the idea of totally replacing an actual human being with just analysis you find online, that I have less sympathy for. And obviously an independent question has to be, how does artificial intelligence fit into this, which is I've been thinking about a lot now, but that didn't make it into this book. But obviously that is the question that people are going to have to grapple with in now and in the future.
Well, what are the current responses that you've come across regarding artificial intelligence? Or honestly, you can save this for the next book, but just a little taste.
So I'll be honest that there's very little. I mean, I find it very unfortunate. As I mentioned at the beginning, I find it critical that poskim not just respond to technology, but be there in front of technology. There's an excellent book I like referencing called Future Technology. Future Ethics, which is a book out of Oxford University Press, which is a collection of essays by ethicists writing about future technologies. And in the introduction, they argue that the reason they have to write this book is because if you believe ethics has something to say about the future, then you have to write about technologies that don't yet exist and may never exist, because then you have a hope of affecting how it is shaped, or even just being having something useful to say and how people use it. If you wait till then, technology moves so fast that you just won't get there. So I find it frustrating that there's very little written on artificial intelligence at this point. I mean, there's been a few podcasts, a few shiurim. You go on HaTorah, you'll find a few here and there. Some shiurim are deal with it more substantively, some less. But I think it's relatively fair to say that poskim have not quite tackled the issues yet. I mean, the issues that they have started to tackle a little bit are whether an AI can paskin. That I have seen some on. There's been some people touching on the liability issues, right? Like, but there's so many. If you read the wider literature about AI, there has been not so much written on questions like the halachic response to replacing workers, with artificial intelligence, which are shilas. I've already gotten shilas like this. People who are consultants. Is it problematic halachically for me to integrate AI into my into these companies, knowing that this will drive people out of work, which is obviously part of the general yored lumanot chavero and things like that. But AI just puts another spin. And then there's the unique AI one, which is not totally unique, but the perennial question of is the newest technology, in this case AI, going to replace work, period, and make it that work is a thing of the past? How does halacha respond to that? That's something that's dealt with very, very widely in the general literature, and in philosophy and psychology and sociology, halacha or machshava really I haven't seen many people writing about this, but I think halacha is a very rich literature. I've written about this. I haven't published it yet, but that was one of the things I've really thought about a lot. There's a lot of discussion in general literature about elder care. Like once we can pair robots with artificial intelligence, especially in countries like Japan, There's been 3 books written, just 2 of them called Robots Will Save Japan and one called Robots Will Not Save Japan, all just on the question of whether robots plus artificial intelligence can solve the elder care problem in Japan, which famously has a very low birth rate and therefore a much larger older population than younger population. But I have yet to see, besides for what I've written, anyone deal with the question of, well, what does halacha have to say about this? And obviously, especially in an area like Kibbutz Avim, halacha has a lot to say about the idea of outsourcing, responsibilities of the child to even to other people, kal vachomer, to non-humans. And is there a difference if you outsource it or supplement it? But I'll be honest, I just don't know much of the literature. I think these are questions that people have to start asking because this will be the reality. I mentioned, before that, like, Shmelkis on the Tzivay Haget, the Tzivay Habal by Get, dealt with the video teleconference because, it was present in the air because of sci-fi. But if you go into, if you read, science fiction now, these are the ethical questions that they're grappling with. Science fiction is often a great place to look if you want to know the questions people are grappling with. One of my chavrutot pointed me to a book that I just read in the last 2 days, called Clara and the Sun, which is a fiction book about an advanced artificial intelligence, AF, artificial friend, which, even though the book is a bit futuristic, some of this exists, and there are going to be implications to things like this. But in terms of what exists yet, not that much. There are a few shurim here and there, but I think not enough has been written or spoken about in the halachic community, and that really does bother me. It bothers me. I like I said, I'm trying to write myself, but I challenge other people to think creatively and start writing, because it's I would say it's coming, but it's here, and more is coming. And to understand the technology and respond to it and help shape it and help reshape the way we think about it, I think is critical.
Just in conclusion, we obviously the corona, pose a lot of challenges in terms of normative Jewish law, halachic behavior as it related to prayer and quorum and tefillah and all of that. How do you deal with that in the book in terms of communication platforms and the idea of a community? You touched upon it before, but it's tzibur in a community.
Right. So this was one of the things that I had added to the book that hadn't existed at all in the first sort of iteration of this in the series in the virtual Beit Midrash, because it was post-COVID when I was actually writing the book. Look, at one level, these questions are very local. Which halachot require kol, right? Require a voice, and is a mediated voice. Does that count? And that can be asked in terms of microphones, that can be asked in terms of phones, that can be asked in terms of webcams, that can be asked in terms of a whole bunch of things. And obviously, then you have to distinguish between synchronous and asynchronous communication. You can ask that in terms of isurim, right? Like kol isha. The poskim spend a lot of time trying to figure out, to what extent it's usher when it's, again, not when it's mediated voice, when it's asynchronous, when it's paired with visual, not paired with visual, right? Vadia's, deals a lot of these distinctions in his tshuva. So, at one level, I go through just some of the technicalities. And at a second level, as you mentioned, I think that these touch on the same types of questions as some of the other issues. Like, yes, the definition of community in a minyan is very different than the different definition of community for the purpose of Maradatra or other things, the get cases that we talked about. So on the one hand, they're different. On the other hand, when you think about it, yeah, like there is a connection, because in the world of ritual law as well, the tzibur is a community. Like, that's what it is. It's an edah. And figuring out, whether an edah is formed by joint presence, which is, the way many poskim took it, or not. Is an important question. Obviously, having learned in YU, it was drilled into my head by Rosh or Talmidav, and when I was in Gush, though, I heard it a little bit less there, but I believe, hear it once from Wolfenstein as well. That the Rav was very insistent to paskin like the Rashbash over the Rashba, who thought that at least a minyan for the purpose of Tefillah B'tzibur is presence oriented, and therefore simply being able to see somebody was insufficient to make a minyan. To join to a minyan, maybe, because we see different standards of joining to a minyan that already exists rather than creating the minyan. But the Rashbash was very convinced that the creation of a minyan and that community for that ritual purpose and that creation of the whatever makom hashchina and all the whatever hashkafic and halachic formulations you want to put on it required actual presence, whereas the Rashba at least entertained the possibility that that isn't true, that what matters is sight, is being able to see each other. Now, on the porch minyanim that were such a big thing here in Israel, that was basically the only question that you need to ask, which was, is it about physical presence or is it about sight? Obviously, if you think it's about sight, then you have to ask the second question, which is, would the Rashba then include mediated sight through technology, right? Obviously, if you hold like the Rashbash, you have to be in the same place. Then you can't have a minyan constituted completely on Zoom. If you think that the Rashba allows a porch minyan because you can see each other, well, then you got to figure out, well, do you think that mediated sight through Zoom is sight? And if it is, does that mean you can create a minyan? Now, again, I'm partial to the Rashbash. And again, without getting to the details, that there seems to be a stira on Shulchan Aruch, and stira in the Mishnah Brura. Without getting into that, I'm partial to the more machmir position that the community for minyan requires presence, and therefore, even non-technologically mediated sight. We had a porch minyan, here because the official psak of Rabbi Riskin, who's the rabbi here in Efrat, was that you could have porch minyan in Bishat Chak. And I wasn't super comfortable with it because of my rebbeim, but I was also number 10, and I felt that I couldn't really go against, the Marda'atra. So, we came up with compromise positions following Rosh Sternbach, where we would, create minyanim in a way that wouldn't create a bracha lebatala, right? Like we would do like heiche kedusha even for shacharit. This way we didn't say any extra brachot and things like that. But again, my personal preference is to at least in the case of minyanim to focus on real presence for that community. But again, there are those who don't, and then you got to figure out. I know of no posek who takes the combination of views that sight is sufficient and mediated sight is sufficient, such that I could create a minyan on Zoom. I know of no posek who allows that, even though in theory one could construct such an argument. But I don't think anyone believes that you can combine those. But on the other hand, in terms of performance of certain mitzvot, they do. Meaning already, there were major poskim who thought that in terms of fulfilling the mitzvah of havdalah or something like that, a phone call would be sufficient. In that case, Zoom is no worse. Interestingly, Rav Yitzchak Yosef's tshuva on Zoom minyanim, he was convinced on the one hand that you need presence to create a minyan, but he was also convinced that mediated sight was enough to be mitzdarei. So he thought that joining a minyan in a corona ward or something like that had 10 people, and then you being number 11 and joining on Zoom, you could answer amen, but you couldn't answer amen to a porch minyan because he was willing to accept mediated sight for hitzarfut to a minyan or response to a minyan, but not for the creation of a minyan, right? So these positions are sometimes surprising in the way they combine. But again, these are very detailed questions, and some of them are very technical. Like what counts as shmiya, and some of them are much broader. Again, the minyan one I think is, as much as it's technical, it also is asking, for ritual purposes, what does it mean to create a community? And the broader philosophical questions and the methodological assumptions really overlap with some of the other questions that we could talk about that seemingly have nothing to do with it. Now, again, every area of halacha has to be analyzed on its own terms. That doesn't mean that you can't enlighten your discussion of other areas of halacha. But again, so many details come down to those because and different mitzvot require different standards. Obviously, or isurim. I mean, yichud and chalav Yisrael and things like that. Poskim have talked about webcams, but like chalav Yisrael, as we know, Rav Moshe Feinstein was very famous about saying that knowledge is sufficient to sight. Once you say that, so a webcam, presumably would be sufficient, to prevent something from being chalav. Now a question I didn't get into the book, and this is getting worse with artificial intelligence, is, the assumption of, let's say, Rav Moshe was that, certainty was enough by chalav. And later poskim who invoked Rav Moshe said, well, a webcam provides certainty. But now that artificial intelligence is increasing our ability to create deep fakes, where you won't be able to tell whether what you're looking at is a live stream or a artificially created live stream, that it might actually backtrack, right? Because it could be that a webcam won't be enough if it's easily, if you can easily recreate with a deep fake, something that shows a Jew milking the whatever the case may be. And this is, this just highlights how much you have to be on top of the technology, because 5 years ago you might have said a webcam creates certainty, and nowadays it might not be. And again, going back to the Tzivui Habal we talked about at the beginning, if deep fakes become a thing, they are a thing, but the more deep fakes become a thing, the more that you might say, well, we don't really have certainty. Just because I heard someone's voice or even saw their picture on Zoom, how do I really know it's them? So again, you just have to be really on top of the technology to make sure that you know what the reality is when you're answering the question in front of you.
Okay. Well, I want to urge all our listeners and viewers, and I want to absolutely confirm 100% that this is Rabbi Jonathan Ziring with us today. This is the real thing.
I hope so.
And urge all our viewers and listeners to look in Torah in the Connected World, a halachic perspective on communication technology and social media. It's fascinating as this podcast has been. And Rabbi Ziring, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This has been great. It's really been great to talk about some of these really important issues. And people should feel free to reach out if you have ideas. I like I said, I love having these conversations, and nothing sharpens my thinking on it more than people asking and pushing and suggestions and the like. So I'm happy to hear from people. They can reach out.
Okay.
And continue these conversations.
Thank you again. Thank you so much.
Thank you.